Today's topic is fruit tree pruning, which offers information along with a few suggestions of hands-on practice. The session is recorded, and you'll get a link to the recording in a couple of days. I used these university publications to prepare this talk, but there's no need for you to write them down. They will be included in the follow-up email along with the recording link. And we'll begin with a few key ideas: apical dominance, pruning cuts, a strong framework, how to train a young tree, how to renovate a mature tree, before we get into specifics about how to prune common fruit trees. And I want to thank Bruce Nelson for reviewing this talk. Bruce is a master pruner who retired from Clackamas Community College Horticulture Department. Apical dominance is the work of auxin, a group of growth hormones that concentrate at the tip of a stem to speed up the development of the top bud and inhibit the shoots below. Auxin moves by gravity. Its impact is greatest in the vertical branch, moderate at an angle, and nearly non-existent in a horizontal position. The two main pruning cuts are heading cuts and thinning cuts. Heading cuts remove a portion of a branch. When the terminal bud and auxin associated with it is gone, the buds below are free to grow. Thinning, also called removal cuts, remove the entire branch by cutting at the point of its origin. Heading cuts make the plant bushier. Thinning cuts opens up a plant. When removing thick branches, take 3 steps to complete the job. First, make an undercut about 12 inches from the trunk. Second, remove the weight by cutting 4 to 6 inches beyond the first cut, and then remove the stub. And I'll say more about the final cut next. But before we leave this page, I want to point out a correct cut gives you a round wound, not an oval one. So we need to cut perpendicular to the stem, not at a 45-degree angle. And the link on the page gives you more information. Back to that final cut. It needs to be outside the collar. And collar looks different in different trees. To locate it, begin with the branch bark ridge, where the trunk bark pushes against the branch bark, and then move toward the branch. In this example, the collar is the swollen area, which holds rich energy reserve and chemicals to slow decay. So cut along the yes line to preserve the collar. And now I want to give you an assignment. Walk around your neighborhood, find some trees, locate the collar, and assess the cuts that were made. In this photo, you can see the cut surfaces totally sealed and in the process of sealing. And notice both of them are round, not oval. So we can minimize pruning damage by doing a number of things. The first one is timing, in the sense that when we see a problem, take care of the problem as soon as possible, because ripping off a young shoot is less damaging than sawing off a large branch if we wait. The second thing is prune when the plant is dormant, because that reduces the stress of pruning. And locate the cut to preserve color, as we've just looked at the example. And finally, keep in mind the total amount of foliage removed in 1 year should be kept to 1/3 or 1/4. And fruit trees need a strong framework. The 3 components of a strong framework are angle, placement, and length. By placement, we'll look at the tree 2 ways. Looking from the side, the branches should be spaced 8 to 24 inches apart. And looking down, the branches should radiate from the trunk like spokes of a wheel. The angle of attachment is strongest when it's 45 to 60 degrees. Anything narrower or wider would not be suitable. And in older trees, the branches tend to become farther and farther as the length increase. And that is an issue that needs to be fixed, and we'll talk about that later. So for the home orchard, an open center tree grows lower and easier to reach. The open center will grow wider with the lights penetrating through the center. And the central leader will grow taller with lights hitting the outer layer of the crown. You can also get a modified central leader by basically removing the top branches of a central leader tree. Each kind of fruit tree has its own natural tendency to grow into a certain shape, but all fruit trees can be shaped into an open center form. So we'll talk about how to give a tree a good, strong framework using training and pruning. We'll begin with this bare root tree that has many, many branches, 3 on the top, labeled ABC, and 4 beneath. And I see 2 problems in this tree. The top 3 branches are so close together, they have very narrow branch angle. And if we're trying to create a central leader tree, we only want 1 leader. So in this example, we remove 2 and keep 1 that's labeled B. The second problem is the branches below have very little vertical distance, which means that they will compete against one another and potentially shade each other. So the solution would be removing the middle branches, keeping 1 and 2 to increase the vertical distance. And in order to encourage branching in the remaining shoots, we can tip them off, remove the tip a little bit to encourage bushiness, and repeat that process for a few years. That will give us a good form of a central leader. If we want to create an open center form, this is how we do it. Beginning with a bare root whip, make a heading cut, generally between 18 to 36 inches above the graft union. So before you make this cut, first look below the potential or the hypothetical cut line and make sure that you have at least 3 to 4 dormant buds below, because that's what's going to give you your fruit scaffold or the fruiting branches. And secondly, keep in mind, wherever you make the cut, your fruiting branches will come from below that cut. So for the home orchard, we want to keep the trees smaller and lower. And that's where a lower cut will give us the advantage of a shorter tree than a higher cut. At any rate, after you make the heading cut, it will stimulate shoots to grow. And by the first summer, we're likely to have a tree looking like this with 3 or 4 branches. And in the first winter, come back and clean up the branches. And that gives us an open center form. Now, when we look at our fruit tree, perhaps we have the right number of branches, but they're not pointed in the direction we want. And we can train a branch to redirect it. Simply drive a stake into the ground in the direction you want and tie the branch to the stake. What if the branch angle is too narrow? Well, we can use spreaders like shown in this picture, or weigh the branch down with a string and put some weight at the other end. Whatever tools we use for training, it's important to start early because the young branches are more pliable and they respond well to training. And also check every month and remove the training tools as soon as you get the result, because the young branches are really thin and they can be easily damaged. We do have a video in case you're interested in seeing how training is done. And if you are planting a new tree and you want to keep it small, I recommend this book. The three main tenets are: you begin with a bare root whip, very thin, no larger than 5/8 inch in caliper. And you make a severe heading cut, and this book recommends making the first cut at 24 inches above ground. And then you practice only summer pruning to control the size. And I'll say a little more about summer pruning later. But the one point I want to emphasize here is one of the steps the author recommends is shortening the shoots severely. She recommends by half to 2/3. Keep the task of shortening shoots in mind. In fruit trees, when we shorten the shoot, in general, we thicken and strengthen them, and that's a very good thing. And I'll be talking more about that later. All right, what if your fruit tree is too tall? You can remove the top branches with reduction cuts. This will open up the canopy and let the light in to stimulate new shoots, which gives you option for replacement. And also it gives you an instant reduction in the height. There are two precautions in doing this. The first one is watch your annual pruning budget of 1/3 to 1/4 of the total foliage removed. Don't overdo it. So you may need to take 2 or 3 years to finish the job. And if you prune in the winter, expect vigorous response in rampant water shoots that water sprouts that will need to be managed. And if you prune in the summer, expect sun scald, and it can be pretty drastic in terms of weakening the tree. So do it with care. The cuts that I just showed in this illustration is a third cut that I have not explained yet, and it's called reduction cuts. When you look at a reduction cut and removal cut on the surface, they look similar because both of them are made where two branches come together and we take out one. But in the removal cut, we remove the entirety of generally the smaller branch. And in the reduction cut, we remove the larger branch. Where two branches come together, we make a cut to take out the bigger one, leaving the smaller one. And it works best when the one that's remaining is 1/2 to 1/3 in diameter of the one that's cut. And the purpose of reduction cut is to reduce the vigor of the branch. So now let's review the three types of cuts we've talked about. Heading cuts keeps a portion of a branch and makes the plant bushier. Thinning or removal cut takes out the entire branch and makes the plant more open. Reduction cut keeps a portion of the branch and makes the branch or the stem less vigorous. If you have a mature fruit tree, pruning is a tool to rejuvenate it. We can reduce the height and width and thin the canopy to improve light penetration. And these need to be done over multiple years, generally 3 to 5, and they do carry the risk of tree decline. So again, do it with care and with planning. I show two university publications that provide information on how to do this, if you're interested. And a team of us actually used those resources and led a workshop last year to renovate several mature apple trees. Based on the extension publications, we developed a 3-year plan. And each year we do we will do winter pruning and summer pruning. During the winter, we corrected the form. We took out branches that are too low, too high, overlapping, crossing, etc. And the winter pruning will stimulate suckers. So be sure you monitor those cuts and remove the suckers near where you make the cut when they're young. When they're really tiny, you can just rub them off. And when they're still supple, you can pull them off. And this will allow you to have far less problem to deal with when you do winter pruning. And if you do summer pruning, it will reduce the vigor of trees. And since our trees are quite vigorous, we did a fair amount of summer pruning. We removed shoots and we also shortened many shoots. And I give you a reference for how to do summer pruning here. But essentially, for the fruiting shoot that you want to keep, there will be a cluster of leaves at the base, and you move away from that cluster of leaves, count 3 buds, and cut just below number 3. And that's essentially how you do summer pruning of your fruiting shoots. So in the winter, we focused on the framework, and in the summer, we focused on the fruiting shoot. And the timing for when you do the summer pruning is when you can see a visible terminal bud developed in the shoot for most of the fruiting shoots. All right, moving on. Just as a practice, I suggest that you make a plan for renovation. Even if you don't have a mature tree, just look at the tree that you have and imagine that you need to renovate it, and do a 3-year plan, including winter and summer pruning, putting the time that's appropriate for your tree and your location, and write down the tasks. I think I went through that and I found it really helpful. So to summarize the timing, if there's anything dead, disease damage, take it out right away. In the winter, we prune when it's dormant because it's less stressful on the plant. And we know the winter pruning will stimulate growth in spring, so be ready for managing those suckers. And in addition, for fruit trees, depending on the variety and your location, you could have pathogen activities active in different times of the year. So before you do major cuts, check with your extension office for your variety of tree in terms of what is the most common kind of disease, and see if there are any reasons for you to delay the pruning. All right, and we can prune in the summer. If we do prune in the summer, prune around summer solstice. And the summer pruning will reduce the vigor of a tree. It may lead to sun scald. And in areas with wet winter, the stone fruit, cherry, plum, apricot, peach, etc., should be pruned in the summer immediately after harvest. And that's because of the propensity for disease during the wet winter. Now, we're moving on to talking about specific fruit trees. Now, pruning fruit tree is all about managing fruiting wood. This table from a University of California publication gives you a really good summary on their location and longevity. And again, you will get the link along with the webinar recording, so there's no need to write it down. Depending on the kind of tree, the fruit may grow on shoots or spurs of the tree, and they could be distributed along laterally, shoots or spur, or terminally, meaning at the tip of shoots and spur. The picture on the left shows an apple branch, and we can see long shoots and short shoots and some spurs. And the photo on the right shows a close-up of apple spur and plum spur. So now that we know how shoots and spurs look, Let's learn how to tell their age. The photo on the left shows a plum branch with 1-year-old wood, 2-year-old wood, and older wood. And the photo on the right shows a fruit shoot with the bud scale scarred in the center. Bud scales are like little blankets wrapping around a dormant bud to protect it in the cold. When growth begins, the scales fall off and they leave a scar, or they leave a series of scars on the stem. By identifying these scars and locating them on shoots and spurs, we can figure out the age of the shoots and spurs. So let's go back to our photo here. Using this clue, new wood is richer color and have thinner skin. All right, so this is last year's growth, 1-year-old, bud scale scar right here, and then 2-year-old bud scale scar here, 3-year-old, etc. The same sequence and pattern exist in spurs, but they're just more squished together. So your homework assignment is to look at your fruit tree, identify the bud scale scars, and figure out the age of shoots and spurs. Now we're ready to prune some trees. I want to thank Mike and Jane Collier for opening their home orchard where I took photos for this talk. Let's begin with apples and pears. We know they fruit mostly in spurs and tips of short shoots. We know the wood becomes productive when it's 2 to 3 years old. And we know spurs are very long-lived. So keep this in mind. We know we want to take good care of spurs. So I'll begin with examples of an apple, showing you before and after image of pruning. We also have a video which will repeat and reinforce some of the points I made. So always begin with a framework. Check the framework. Does it have good coverage, 360 degrees? Are the branches well positioned? Are there gaps in the canopy that needs to be filled with replacement branches? And are there some of the fruiting wood that have grown so far from the trunk that they cannot be supported and we need to shorten them? So this is the time to shorten the fruiting wood if they are too long, to remove overlapping or crossing branches, and also to check for suckers that might have come up from the rootstock and cut them off as low as you can. And now we'll tackle shoots. And there are two types of shoots, water sprouts and regular shoots. Water sprouts are vertical, vigorous shoots. And I'll give you 3 options in dealing with them. Number 1, remove it completely. Number 2, cut it to one bud. And this may force spur development. Number 3, you have the option of training it by bending it downward and turn it into a productive branch. And remember, in apples, the general rule is we can remove 20% of last year's growth. So keep that in mind as you go through the plant in doing the removal. And when we're done, our shoots should be about 7 to 9 inches apart. And this, of course, is to minimize the competition. And always begin in the top portion of the plant where the most vigorous growth occur, so you don't run out of your pruning budget, if you begin from down below or at eye level. I'm going to share with you the general guidelines from Orrin Martin, who's the author of a book called Fruit Trees for Every Garden. I think these suggestions are really helpful in thinking about which shoots to save and which to remove and what to do with the ones that we do save. He said, if a shoot is vertical, too vigorous, take it out. If the shoot is moderate or weaker looking, and that's measured by how much it grew last year. So if it's shorter than, let's say, 8 to 10 inches, and it's grown at an angle, and that will be considered a moderate or weaker shoot, leave it alone, keep it, because they're likely to fruit on their own, and you don't have to manage them. If the shoot grew long, which would suggest vigorous, so greater than 10 inches from last season, you want to cut it back because otherwise it will have a tendency of taking over and focus on vegetative growth instead of producing fruit. So you want to shorten it to a few buds and see if you could not force fruiting spurs to develop. And after we address the shoots, we can next look at spurs. We know spurs are long-lived, and the tips are basically for the strong ones, check to see if they have overhead shade that might have developed and thin it out so they have plenty of sunlight. For the older spurs or weaker ones, you may remove them or head them back, just shorten them a little bit and see if that could not rejuvenate them and stimulate some new growth. And also earlier, I talked about shortening the shoots to encourage spur development. So that may help give us more spurs down the road. And the final step in finishing the pruning job is thinning fruit. And there are two ways to do it. The first one is we can shorten the fruiting branches by using thinning cuts. Follow the example on the left. This, I think, is much easier because as part of the dormant pruning, you can see the structure, measure the fruiting wood length, and make sure you shorten them. And at the same time, because we're not looking at fruits, it's much easier. If we wait until later in the season when fruits have developed and save most of the thinning job for then, it's just more gut-wrenching. Now, we still have to thin fruit even if we had done the branch thinning during the winter. Ideally, apples should be thinned to 6 to 8 inches apart, or one fruit in a cluster. And the time to thin is when the fruit is the size of a dime to a quarter, so fairly small. And wait until after what's called June drop, which happens usually in June when the tree naturally shed fruit. So after that is the time to do the rest of the fruit thinning. Okay, so I've completed the process of different components of fruit tree pruning. And let's review those ideas one more time using the Asian pear as an example. So this is the Asian pear before and after. And we look at the framework first and correct anything major in branch position, crossing the length of the branch, and also checking for suckers. Then we look at the shoots, taking care of water sprouts and shoots using their vigor as a guide. The very vigorous ones we want to remove or severely shorten, and the moderate or weaker ones we leave alone. And in general, for Asian pears, we can remove 20% of last year's growth. And in this Asian pear that we pruned, we did have some of the fruiting wood getting too far away, and we're afraid that the weight will break the branch during the season. So we made a cut here to reduce the weight of this branch, which also lessened the burden on the next branch. Asian pear spurs, long-lived, so we check their exposure to sun. renovated some of the old old spurs, and also did some cutting back of the shoots to stimulate more spur development. And finally, fruit thinning by thinning the fruiting branches and thinning the fruits. And fruit thinning, again, do it after June drop. And for the Asian pears, the recommended distance is 6 to 8 inches apart. And also the one fruit per flower cluster. All right, now that we have gone through all of these steps, let's pick up the speed and get into some of the other types of fruits. So let's begin with cherry. We know cherry fruit spurs and along short shoots. There are minor differences between sweet cherry and sour cherry, but both of them have long living spurs. And so again, take care of the spurs because they can produce for so long. So the pruning tips are prune them in the summer because winter disease can be a major issue. Remove 20% of last year's growth because that would allow us to have fruit for this year. Because again, the 1-year-old shoot is where we get fruit in addition to the spurs. And removing some of these shoots will allow us to have light penetration on the current season fruit. And we want to avoid major cuts. And major cut is anything larger than 2-inch diameter because they can lead to rot. This shows our cherry tree before and after the pruning. And what we did are to open up the center. There were some crossing and downward facing branches that we removed. We also shortened and removed some of the long shoots. And in general, we did not do a lot of work. The major cut we made is a reduction cut here because the tree was getting too tall and we need to reduce the height. And I had explained the reduction cut. Remember, it's removing the larger portion of the branch, the larger branch where two branches come together. Next is plums and apricot. They fruit on spurs and along short shoots. And again, there are some variations between the different kinds of plum and between plum and apricot, but in general, they have productive spurs, and also the young wood is more productive. We're looking at, again, pruning the summer to reduce disease pressure, removing roughly 20% of last year's growth. And remember the tip of shortening shoots in order to stimulate fruiting wood. So in many of these, after we remove the shoots that we don't want, we will shorten the shoots to a few buds, and that will stimulate fruiting wood and also make the remaining shoot stronger. And in plums and apricot, fruit should be thinned to a smaller distance apart, 3 to 5 inches for European plum and apricot, and 5 to 6 inches for Asian plum and pluot. And apricot can take even harder pruning. The recommendation is remove 1/3 of new shoots and then shorten the rest. We pruned an Italian plum, and here you can see the before and after photo. And basically, we looked at the overall structure, removed some crossing and overlapping branches, shortened some new shoots to 2-3 buds. And again, pretty light pruning, roughly 20% of last year's growth. One thing I want to mention is when you winter prune, not only walk around the tree to look at the need for pruning and assess whether the job is done well, but also go underneath the canopy. This photo is taken from getting under this plum tree and looking up. Sometimes looking from a different angle allows us to see better where there is overlapping branches or congestion. Something else I want to mention is plum and apricot, they may need to have their scaffold or main fruiting branches renewed, because over time, the wood can become too long and the fruiting portion becomes so far away and out of reach. But rescaffolding is a big job. It's done basically by cutting a scaffold branch, a main fruiting branch, very hard. So for example, a 10-foot branch, you would cut it down to 2 foot above ground and stimulate new growth for a new scaffold. So it's not for the faint of heart, and I'm not recommending it. I'm just pointing out there is an opportunity, but make sure you read more about it before taking that on. Let's talk about peach and nectarine. Peach and nectarine fruit along long shoots. There's no spurs involved, and they fruit on 1-year-old wood. So these trees need constant renewal. And anything that's 2 years or older is scaffold. It's the support for the fruiting wood. So the pruning tip is very heavy pruning. We're removing 40 to 60% of last season's growth, and we need to shorten the remaining shoots quite a lot, 1/3 to 2/3, to lighten the fruit load. And the fruits should be thinned to no more than 3 to 4 fruit per branch, or 5 to 6 inches apart. And persimmon, moving on. Persimmon's fruit on current season growth from 1-year-old wood. So this picture shows older wood and then younger looking wood, and that's 1-year-old wood. And the fruit will come from the buds on this 1-year-old branch. So imagine this branch, if I don't cut it back to just a few buds, every bud will potentially grow a new shoot this year. And that's where the fruits will develop. So potentially this branch can become very, very heavy. And I show you this example to illustrate for a branch like this, even though the tree is strong and have a strong framework, we would want to probably only allow 2, 3, 4 buds to stay. And this way, the number of fruit will be moderate, and there will be good light penetration to reach the fruit as a good quality fruit. Figs produce 2 crops in the Pacific Northwest. The first crop is formed last year and will ripen in early summer. The second crop is formed the current year on new wood and will ripen later in the season. So the way to prune figs is in the winter, well, before the tree begins to grow, you will shorten 50% of last year's shoots and cut it to just 2 buds. And then the shoots that are not cut will be where we get our first crop early summer. And the shoots that were shortened will grow new shoots and produce a second crop in late summer, early fall. So I've reviewed how to go about pruning different kinds of fruit trees, and all of that information is summarized in this one table, and you will get the link to this publication. And to wrap it up, I know sometimes it's confusing when we talk about winter pruning, summer pruning, different percentage of pruning, etc. And so I want to just review one more time. In the winter, we want to focus on the framework, develop the framework, and correct the framework. And by that, I mean, do we have good coverage around the trunk? Do we have overlapping branches? Is there a good vertical distance between branches? Make the correction in the winter when we can see the structure very well. And in the summer, we do not touch the framework. We focus on the shoots or the laterals. And during that time, we're removing them or shortening them. The beauty of summer pruning is we're going to get very little regrowth, if any, depending on the timing of the cut. While with winter pruning, we're guaranteed to get the plant responding with vigorous growth where we make the cut. And then with fruits, we need to reduce the fruiting wood in the winter, and in the summer, we need to thin the fruit when their size is between a dime and a quarter.
I can tell you, I learn something new every time I watch your fruit pruning video, and it's just in time for the winter pruning. We had a lot of questions, and the group did a really good job of answering those questions individually to the people. But I do have a few for you. You didn't really cover espaliered fruit trees. Could you talk a little bit about kind of how you would go into pruning or training those?
Yeah. Espalier is a way to grow a three-dimensional tree in a two-dimensional space. And usually it's grown against a wall or some kind of a support structure. So in the simplest way to think about it is we develop a framework for the fruit tree that would support continued growth and development in 2D against the structure. There are a lot of different forms that we can choose from, but the most common and basic one is to begin with a vertical trunk and then with horizontal branches coming off the trunk going opposite directions, one or two or more tiers. And those horizontal branches are supported by something like wires or a connection to a fence. So, how do you prune espalier? Well, first, in choosing the kind of tree you use to do an espalier, it's a good idea to choose a variety that focus on producing wood in spurs. Because if you have a, let's say, an apple espalier, and it is a tip producing apple at the tip of shoots, then you're in trouble. Because in order for you to get a harvest, you just need the tree to grow very rapidly, and you need to save the tips of the shoots, which goes against the shape of espalier. So choose the right variety, set up the simple structure, and then in the winter, you're really not doing much pruning. You're looking at the structure, making the correction to structure, the same way that we talked about the 3D tree. And the rest of the season, in the spring, you're lightly correcting the form. So if you have shoots that are too long, you'll want to shorten it because otherwise it'll be shading all of your new growth and the fruits. And you want to do most of your pruning in the summer, as the way we talked about for a 3D tree,
Right.
because that's a way to control the vigor. So I think the simplest way to think about keeping an espalier tree in good shape is really standing back, looking at your tree, and take out the branches that don't fit your mental picture.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. But what about if you have a tree that has different, multi types? In other words, you have an apple that has 3 or 4 different types of apples on it. Do you prune it differently?
Yes, if you have a multi-grafted tree, you need to manage each graft on its own. And at the same time, you need to look at the overall picture. So you have to think about the pruning in two ways. Um, multi-graft is a really good idea, but it's very difficult to execute perfectly. And the reason is because it's not the homeowner's fault through pruning. And it's because usually the various graft have different built-in genetic vigor. Some just are more vigorous than others. So in a multi-grafted tree, the vigorous varieties tend to take over, and the weaker varieties tend to wither away. Um, you need to manage the fruiting wood for each variety. So each grafted branch, you need to look at the overall growth and
Okay.
pruning the way that's going to give you the most fruiting wood and the best spur position, like we talked about in the 3D tree.
Uh-huh.
But you also need to look at the overall tree and remove more of the more vigorous one and by using thinning cuts. So
Right.
the vigorous branches, you want to prune in the summer to suppress the growth and also use thinning cuts. But for your weaker branches, you want to prune in the winter, and you can use thinning and heading cuts in order to stimulate more growth.
Right.
Does
Okay.
that make
Um,
sense?
yeah, it does to me.
Yeah, it's tricky.
I won't do a multi grafted. Several people are kind of confused about a spur and a shoot, the difference between a spur and a shoot. Can you explain that?
Yeah, actually, the spur is just a very short shoot.
Okay.
That's kind of a way to think about it. I've shown a number of pictures of long shoot, short shoot, and spur. And if you look at your tree, spurs are um, like miniature shoots. They are very compact and compressed together. And I would say if you're confused, look at the images in this webinar and also look at some fruiting trees, because when you can see a spur, if you find on any fruiting branches these very short stubby things, and those are spurs.
Okay. Right.
Okay, so just take a look and there will be no confusion.
Okay. Sounds good. Um, this person had a 6-year-old apple tree and it's really healthy, but it never gets any flowers and never gets any fruit and wants to know what are they doing wrong? Why?
Hmm. Well, no flower is a concern. I mean, no
Yeah.
fruit would be potentially issue with pollination, weather, but no flower. It makes me wonder, does the tree get enough sun? Um, how well is it growing in general?
Yeah.
And can you think of anything else?
No, that, like you say, not flowering, there's definitely something wrong. It might just be the tree itself. I think after 6, 7 years, I might give up and try something else. So,
Well,
I mean, that's
uh,
what would be.
yeah,
Um,
okay.
and someone said, what happens if you over prune your tree? If you find out you just prune the heck out of it one year, what's going to happen? You're going to lose that tree.
Probably not. Over prune, there are different degrees. I think if you over prune by removing more than a third of the foliage, which is the standard pruning budget, you
Yeah,
may weaken your tree. But if you did that over pruning in the winter, you might have overstimulated the tree into responding and growing a lot vigorously. So if you have done it already, I would say just watch how the tree respond. It's pretty difficult to kill a tree other than, like making really crazy cuts in a way
yeah,
that below the cut, there are no buds there anymore. That's really the only way to cut a tree, to kill a tree,
right.
I mean.
Okay. This person had a quince and they cut out the central leader a few years ago, and now it seems like all the branches seem to be growing really long and thin. Um, is that because they cut out the central leader? Is there a
No,
way to fix that?
yeah, I don't think that's related necessarily. I think what they ought to do is look at the example in the Asian pear in this talk, and
Yeah,
I showed image of shortening the fruiting branch with basically every fruit tree without pruning or, annual pruning. Your fruiting branches will just become longer, and with the weight of the fruit, the branches will come down and become at a wider angle, and your fruiting wood will get to be farther from the center.
yeah,
So it's kind of natural to need to, bring the fruiting wood back toward the center by shortening some of the branches. And I think the image I show there would give a good example.
okay. Um, this person had a dwarf cherry tree that was too tall, and they wanted to know how they can cut severely reduce the size. You talked a little bit about this. You talked about the difference between removal and reduction. Can you kind of talk about that in regards to bringing a tree down again?
Yeah, I hate to talk about the concept of re-scaffolding, which can happen with cherry or plum. And part of it is to do that, basically your fruiting wood becomes so tall, out of reach, you have the option of just making a very drastic cut. So the examples that I've read are you basically cut it down to 2 feet above ground and let it regrow. The challenge for doing that in our climate is, first of all, these are stone fruits, so you wouldn't want to do that in the winter
Right.
because of the potential of rot or disease.
Yeah.
But when you do it in the summer, there is not going to be the vigor in the tree to grow the new branches in response to this rescaffolding. So that is a very tricky practice.
Yeah.
I would say you can practice using a reduction cut in our climate. So that is cut the bigger branch where two branches come together and leave the side shoot. And in this instance, your reduction cut will weaken the shoot, I mean, the branch that you cut, but it does give the plant an outlet for kind of a growing sideways and continue to keep that branch. So we reduce the size of the wound, potentially reduce the problem of disease pressure. um, it's probably worth giving it a try. But don't do that to all the fruiting branches. Try it on one season, and maybe do it in late spring, early summer when there is a dry period instead of
Mhm.
waiting until the middle of summer.
Yeah. Okay. This was interesting. This person said, if you're winter pruning and summer pruning the same tree, how do you calculate the percentage that you take off? If you're talking about an apple, you said take off a third. Is that a third in winter and summer, or what?
Yes, the pruning budget is for the whole year. So if
Okay.
you heavily prune in the winter, you're going to have to prune very lightly in the summer. But
Okay.
really, what we should all do is move away from very heavy-handed pruning during the winter. Because I think, if anything, I hope this presentation shows, if you prune in the winter, you just create more work for you to deal with in correcting the result of that pruning because of the tree's vigorous response. And if you prune in the summer, you basically have little or no consequence from that pruning.
Okay. It's I know it's 1 o'clock, but just me one more question for you, and that is, this poor lady, she watched a YouTube video and she pruned her fig, and then last year it didn't produce anything, and her husband said it was her fault because she pruned it. So what she wants to know is, do figs grow like kind of, are they alternate bearing like some apples where they get a lot one year and not very many the next year, or was it her fault?
Um, well, I don't think it's her fault uh, that the fig did not produce because we know figs produce on current year new wood, and they also
Mhm.
produce on last year's growth. So, um, even if she pruned this year very hard, if she pruned at a time that allowed the pruning to stimulate new growth, she should
Mhm.
still have some figs, just from the new growth.
Right.
So I would say, no, it's not your fault, but
Yeah.
but what you want to do is prune, keep in mind that only really young wood will produce. So when the fig gets too big, you can make very harsh cut. Cut it to 1 to 2 feet above ground, not a problem, and stimulate the new growth and essentially grow your tree just from that new growth rather than living with, 10-foot tall trunks. um, you will not kill your fig. They're very vigorous and they actually welcome that kind of rejuvenation.
Well, then let me ask you this question for my fig. I've had it for several years and it's just really small and it doesn't grow very much at all. Plus, the deer broke off 2 limbs. If I cut that one down to about 3 feet, just almost like starting a new tree.
Yes, yes, you can cut any established fig tree to 2, 3 feet above ground, let the new growth take over and reshape your new tree. And once you have, I think the important thing with figs is we know they're very vigorous growers.
Mhm.
Once they get established and have a good root system, they can grow easily 2, 3 feet a season in the new shoot. So the challenge once the tree is established is there's so much pruning you have to do in order to really keep up stimulating new growth to get figs.
Yeah.
Um, and what you ought to do is just make very harsh cut and encourage the tree to grow kind of sideways. Give it an open center, allow the sunlight to go in to the center, and have maybe 3, 4 main trunks going around for the 360 coverage. And then with each trunk, heavily prune it, stimulate the branching so you have a lot of low branches, and that's going to give you the plentiful fruit in figs.
All right. Great. Thank you, Sherry. That was a great presentation. Looking forward to next week.
Thank you. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.